Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut's Spring 2026 series, talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm pleased to be your host. In honor of America's 250th anniversary, today architectural historian Dr. James Sexton will lead us in an exploration of colonial era architecture and the Colonial Revival style, which was brought back into prominence by the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893. In this session of talking about preservation, Dr. Sexton will reflect on the defining characteristics of colonial houses, the ways those forms evolved over time, and the emergence of colonial revival architecture in the 1870s as an expression of American values. He will also consider why the style reached new heights of popularity during the moments of both uncertainty, such as in the 1920s, and national celebration, including the Bicentennial in 1976. Over the decades that followed, Colonial Revival was embraced by the public, becoming and remaining the most enduring and widely favored style in American domestic architecture. But before I hand the program off to Dr. Sexton, I'd like to take a moment to share with you some information about Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide, private, nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm proud to say that for 50 years, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is located in the Eli Whitney Boarding House in Hamden. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it's the only surviving structure of the industrial village that centered on Eli Whitney's armory, and it has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 10 preservation professionals and a board of 29 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries and can be reached at our website, preservationct.org. Christopher Wiegren is Deputy Director and Editor of Connecticut Preservation News, our acclaimed bi-monthly newsletter. Chris heads our Preservation Easements program, survey projects, and gives wonderful architectural history talks, especially those exploring his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Mike Farino, Director of Preservation and Partnerships, provides management of the field service team, including circuit riders and preservation staff. He provides oversight of grant programs, surveys, and other special projects, and through field service and outreach, cultivates and grows our partner network. Jordan Sorensen, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Operations, ensures all Preservation Connecticut activities align with the brand and strategic plan. She leads the planning, execution, and monitoring of strategic projects and organizational business operations. Renee Tribert, Preservation Service Manager, provides municipal and developer engagement assistance, identifying, planning, and capital needs, and an array of preservation solutions. Kristen Hopewood, Development and Outreach Manager, leads fundraising efforts, manages member and donor relations, and plans engaging community programs and exclusive special events. Brad Scheid, our Senior Circuit Rider. The Circuit Rider team is our signature program in providing on-site technical assistance. Brad leads Connecticut Environmental Protection Act interventions through community organizing and coordination of professional teams. Stacy Vero, Circuit Rider and Education Manager, responds to technical assistance inquiries around the state and provides an array of educational programs and talks, including talking about preservation and training for members of historic district commissions. Stefan Danchuk, Field Service and Program Coordinator, provides support for the Circuit Rider team with expertise in archaeology, grants management, and social media, and capturing drone images and video. Amelia Mower is our Edward F. Gerber Circuit Rider Fellow, a 2-year field service position in which she provides support to our whole team. Preservation Connecticut's mission to enhance and sustain the culture and vitality of Connecticut's varied communities by preserving, protecting, and promoting historic places, which embody the stories of our shared past and enrich our shared future. Since 2020, we've been doing these lunchtime preservation chats, and we have quite an impressive library of those programs on our YouTube channel. Today's session makes number 81 in the library. So I do hope that you'll visit our YouTube channel and check out all of the programs there that you may have missed. And feel free to let us know about topics that you'd like to hear about next. We would love to hear from you. Also coming up, July 15th, we will do an in-person talking about preservation at the Ridgefield Historical Society to explore the Battle of Ridgefield, including recently discovered archaeology findings. And before that, on June 18th at 4:30 p.m., we're doing a special event, an evening at the Palmer Warner House in East Haddam. Please join us for a fundraiser to support Preservation Connecticut's LGBTQ+ Historic Places project, the first comprehensive effort to identify, commemorate, and preserve historic sites associated with the state's LGBTQ community. So go to our website, preservationct.org, and get your tickets. They will sell out. We have a capacity of 50, so we'd like to see as many of you there as possible. So I'm going to stop sharing and let James take over the controls. And while you're doing that, James, I will introduce you. So please join me in welcoming James Sexton, a native of coastal Connecticut. Dr. Sexton has spent much of his professional life pursuing research in New England with a concentration in Connecticut. He graduated from Yale as an undergrad and returned to complete his PhD in the history of art. His dissertation focused on changes in community structure as reflected in the buildings of 17th and 18th century Guilford. He has worked on countless state and National Register nominations, historic resource inventories, surveys, tax credit projects, and regulatory projects all over the country. Dr. Sexton has more than 30 years of experience in the investigation and documentation of historic properties and has an excellent understanding of above-ground cultural resources. Notable to us here at Preservation Connecticut, he served as the lead architectural historian for our Connecticut Town Greens survey and the initial phases of Historic Barns of Connecticut survey. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sexton.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Preservation Connecticut. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. I will begin with a little bit of an apology. The description that appeared in the e-blast sounds like the précis of a wonderful book that I would love to read. It's the result of a conversation that I had with Stacy, and we covered a lot of ground. In fact, we covered so much ground that I thought it was a little too much for a lunchtime talk. So instead, I'm trying to contain myself to a single question. How colonial is the Colonial Revival? And then a slight corollary. And does it matter? On the screen is the Connecticut State Building from the 1907 Jamestown Exposition, designed by E.G.W. Dietrich, an architect, embarrassingly, from New York, who used the Colonel Talmadge home in Litchfield as inspiration for this building. So with that, let's dive in. As a working architectural historian, there are two books that come off my shelf first when I have to assign a style to a building. The first, represented by the illustration on the right, is Virginia and Lee McAllister's A Field Guide to American Houses. And on the left, the two illustrations are from Connecticut resident Rachel Carley's The Visual Dictionary of American Domestic Architecture. So, Colonial Revival is, for me, a slippery subject. Identifying a building as Colonial Revival often isn't the relatively straightforward task of defining other styles like the Greek Revival, Craftsman, Tudor Revival. Those styles are narrowly defined with clear character-defining features. Colonial Revival, on the other hand, is a larger tent. If you look at the right, you can see that the McAllisters show 9 principal building types that they feel represent the majority of the Colonial Revival buildings. And Rachel, with the other 3 illustrations, shows buildings that are wildly different from each other, but all in many ways fall under the umbrella of the Colonial Revival. It is, as I hope to show, a not particularly cohesive style. It's almost a grab bag for a side gable building without the distinct characteristics of another style. In trying to understand why I struggle with the Colonial Revival, it seemed to make sense to go back to its origins. In other words, to understand what is being revived, one needs to define it. I was happy to find during my research that I'm not the only one who has faced this challenge. In 1919, C. Matlack Price, in his Historic Houses of Litchfield, published in the White Pine series of architectural monographs, said the following: "Perhaps there is an increasingly general appreciation of the possibilities and variations to be found in the whole range of early American architecture. By an exact application of the word colonial, which is more often used very inexactly, there would exist no designation for the first architecture of the American nation, and all works subsequent to 1776 would either be wrongly named or would exist without a name. Colonial, too, is inexact because it recognizes no distinction of locality. And certainly there are wide differences between the early buildings of New England and those of the southern states, not to speak of the locally characteristic styles of Pennsylvania and those parts of New Jersey and New York states which were first settled by the Dutch. In unpacking that, I focused on 3 different aspects. The first is the era, the time period. And that one, at the outset, seems fairly straightforward. The colonial period was the time during which there was a colonial power in charge. However, that becomes difficult because you can't limit it to a single power in the US, since our part of North America was under the control of several different colonial powers before it became the United States. The second is the type or the form. As Price notes, there are regional variations. He calls these locally characteristic styles, although I would argue that style and form are slightly different. And I will talk more about that in a moment. But for the Colonial Revival, there is generally a focus on New England and southern states, which were settled by English colonizers. In my talk, I'll focus on New England. That's where we all are, if only electronically, and with a few examples from elsewhere in the 13 colonies that were under English control in 1776. As a side note, as I'm sure you all know, examples from other cultural traditions often get a modifier on their name, so they become Dutch colonial or Spanish colonial. Price tried to correct this wrong. And in the same piece, he wrote, quote, "For this reason, the term early American, while a little vague for an exact definition, should be more generally used than the misapplied term colonial. For it embraces not only all pre-revolutionary work, but also the whole range of American architecture from 1776 through the classical revival, which he contended flourished from 1830 until about 1840 or a little later." Obviously, that was not generally accepted, and we have ended up where we are. So, one of the challenges here is the vast range of colonial building types. There are many, many. Many of these have been identified or named in recent times. And they identify a sort of double-edged challenge behind the Colonial Revival. There is much to choose from for designers. They can pick and choose from a large number of building types and styles, but it makes it a very, very broad category. So just to run through these, in the upper right is the Gilman Garrison House from Exeter, New Hampshire, constructed 1709. Beneath that is a building with a framed overhang, the Moore House in Windsor, dated 1664. In the lower right is the Painter House of West Haven, or formerly of West Haven. It was moved to Litchfield in 1959. At that time, it was, I think, somewhat optimistically given a construction of 1695, but it demonstrates the classic salt box style. Moving to the left on the bottom is a building with a hewn overhang. That is the Highland House in Guilford, which has been dendro dated to 1712, 1713. The center picture is of a Cape Cod house, or a cape. This is one of, if not the only, building that's still known by a type name that was contemporary with it. So Timothy Dwight described the type in the early 19th century as being one story, covered on the sides as well as the roofs, with pine shingles. Chimney is in the middle, and on each side of the door are two windows. The roof is straight. Under it are two chambers, and there are two larger and two smaller windows in the gable end. This doesn't exactly match his definition. As you can see, there are 6 rather than 4 windows in the gable, but it's a good illustrative example of the type. Above that on the right is a building with an added lean-to. You can see the break in that rear long roof line. It's the Comfort Star House in Guilford, which has been dendro dated to 1695. and for those of you that don't live in my world, dendrodating is the dating of buildings by examining the tree rings in their timbers, and it's officially dendrochronology, that study of tree ring variation. To the left of that is one of the very rare Connecticut stone enders. It's the John Norton House, formerly of Guilford. It's traditionally dated to 1725, but maybe a little bit later than that. It was raised in the 1920s. In the lower left corner is, for lack of a better term, an early high-style building. It's the Theophilus Eaton House of New Haven, again, circa 1640 for that, and again, no longer standing. Above that is the Center Hall House, the Webb House in Wethersfield, 1752. Above that is the John Hancock House, as one might expect, having looked at his signature on the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot going on. It's big, it's bold. It was built in 1734 and demolished in 1863. And then finally, the brick house in the upper left corner is the Barker House in Wallingford of 1756. These are just some of the variations that appeared in the colonial period. As you can see by looking at them, they're all fairly substantial houses, and that's one of the things which we no longer see, but certainly at the beginning of the Colonial Revival period, there would have been an even greater variety of colonial buildings, with smaller houses, less robustly built buildings, still being visible in the landscape, including things like, post-hole buildings where the timber frames are built into the earth rather than upon a stone or brick foundation. So there was a lot to choose from. If you're interested in those buildings that are no longer there, Ann Smith, 2 decades ago or so, worked with the 1798 direct tax records to document the variety of buildings that were extant in, I think it was in Waterbury at the end of that period. So those are the forms. Style is, in many ways, and in the way in which I'm using it here, is what's added to the basic forms. And ultimately, these become the elements that were cherry-picked by Colonial Revival architects. The style of these buildings is the case today, are arrayed along a very broad continuum. They run from the very simple to the highly ornamented, the unadorned to the houses of the river gods and the buildings in urban centers like Boston, New York, Charleston, Annapolis. So in the upper right is the Ebenezer Grant House, 1757. This was associated with Abiel Gray, a builder. It's in East Windsor Hill. And you can see, instead of a standard plain 5-base facade on the ground floor, the door has an elaborate what we now call a river god door surround. The lower floor windows have elaborate window caps. Um, it's a building that announces who lives there. Beneath that is the Old Boston State House of 1713. It's an institutional building. It's brick. And again, it's got elaborate window heads. It's got a statement door surround. It's got a parapet wall. It's got dormers. It's got a turret. It is a building that announces its presence. And it does it through the addition of those stylistic elements. To the left of that is the Darling House in Woodbridge. Again, it is at its core a simple house. 4 rooms on the first floor, 4 rooms on the second floor, a very small garret space. To that simple form have been added dormers, have been added, you can't really see them in the photograph, but a slightly elaborated window surrounds, an elaborated door surround with a transom, and perhaps interesting, well, most interesting to me, although it now wears Victorian dress, the piazza or piazzer on the left gable end is an original feature of the building. There are notes and correspondence between the owner and the builder, again, Abiel Gray, from East Hartford, discussing the piazza and what materials were used for it, that sort of thing. In the center is Drayton Hall in Charleston, a brick building with a double-pitched hipped roof, that in subtle ways announces itself as a Neo-Palladian descendant. It's got, again, an elaborate, classically inspired door surround. It has the 3 windows in the center frontispiece, called out with alternating window heads. The frontispiece is capped by that small cross gable, again with a decorative element in the center of the tympanum. On the lower left is Touro Synagogue, 1763, and Newport. And again, it has, for a relatively simple form, it has round-headed windows. It has a portico, an arched portico with a classical cap. It's got modillions on both the portico and the main roofline. It has a belt course, again, sort of taking the form and jazzing it up. Above that is Connecticut Hall in New Haven of 1750 or 1752-52. Like the State House, it is a institutional building, which is functional, but still, has belt courses, has elaborate window heads. It's got a series of dormers. It has a decorative window in the top of the gable. It is more than just a plain Jane building. So it is these elements of style which are frequently lifted and used by Colonial Revival architects, again, sometimes out of context, but clearly they provide the historical antecedents that the Colonial Revival architects often sought. So at the end of the colonial period, as new buildings were constructed, as new styles were beginning to be embraced, what happened was what frequently happens. The people using the new styles began to forget about the old styles. The interest in colonial buildings never completely vanished, but they definitely began to fall out of style. This leads to one of the, if not the earliest, examples of preservation in the country. And it highlights a couple of things. So the story is that in 1816, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was considering demolishing the Pennsylvania State House, what we now know as Independence Hall. Now, this inspired a bit of a backlash, and in 1818, the city of Philadelphia bought the building and property for $70,000. The reason for this, as one can imagine, is that the building had, as few buildings do, star power. It was the site of one of the most important events in the history of the country, the ratification and signing of the Declaration of Independence. And even though it was less than 50 years after that happened, there was some recognition of the significance of that event. The building's star power, for lack of a better term, increased as the Park Service notes. After Revolutionary War hero Marquis de Lafayette visited the building in 1824, public sentiment advocated for the restoration of the building to its 1776 appearance. Strickland's steeple deviated from the original 1776 steeple design through its incorporation of a clock and a use of more ornamentation. On the right, you can see drawings from the original building, and on the left, you can see the preserved but improved building as it was visualized by Strickland. And I don't want to imply that colonial buildings disappeared or even disappeared from the consciousness of 19th century Americans. These buildings weren't forgotten, but they also weren't really celebrated. They were touch points or geographic landmarks. The Whitfield House in Guilford on the left, in its National Historic Landmark nomination, notes that both Timothy Dwight mentioned the building in his travel diaries from the early 19th century, and also that a view of the house appeared in John Warner Barber's Connecticut Historical Collections of 1828, and that's the view on the left. On the right is a sketch done by Barber of Morris Cove. You can see that he picks out Fort Nathan Hale in sort of the lower right-hand quadrant of the drawing. And on the lower left-hand quadrant, although it's not labeled, he shows a view of the Pardee Morris house. This is all in New Haven out by Lighthouse Point. And it's interesting that in trying to find a view that gave a sense of place to Morris Cove, Barber included this historic building as the prominent feature um, in the drawing. Then there is what is often referred to as the beginning of the modern preservation movement. That is the saving of Washington's Mount Vernon. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association was founded in 1853 by Anne Pamela Cunningham. It's recognized as the oldest national historic preservation organization, it's a mouthful, in the US, and the oldest patriotic women's society in the country. It is notable for two reasons. One is that it was prior to the Centennial, which, as you'll see in a moment, I consider a watershed moment. And the other is that it highlights what became a longstanding tradition of preservation being led by women and women's groups, which is a significant feature. In the upper right is a quote from Cunningham, quote, "If the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero to go to ruin, why can't the women of America band together to save it?" This may be apocryphal, but it certainly is a great quote. And it does also, in addition to highlighting the role of women, again, sort of highlight the importance of a heroic figure to driving the preservation effort. In a 1991 history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, Gerald Johnson described the moment that led to the preservation of the building. Quote, "The paint was peeling from the walls, the roof was sagging, at least one of the great pillars along the front had collapsed and been replaced by scantlings. The lawn was waist-high in rioting weeds. It was a picture of neglect, decay, and desolation, and the passenger could not get it out of her mind." So during the pre-centennial period, there's an awareness of the colonial era, and to some extent its significance. But again, that significance mostly focuses on the heroes, the highlights. Then came 1876. Celebration of the centennial of our founding unleashed a wave of patriotism that manifested itself in a variety of ways. One of the things that grew out of the centennial was noted by Robert Swain Peabody, architect, in his Georgian Houses of New England, published in American Architect and Building News in October of 1877. He said, quote, "Americans, quote, discovered that we too have a past worthy of study. Our colonial work is our only native source of antiquarian study and inspiration." It was a light bulb moment in a pre-light bulb world. Americans begin to stop looking, well, not stop. In addition to looking to Europe for history, they begin looking around their own hometowns, around our own country. Harold Eberlein, in The Architecture of Colonial America, phrased it in an equally potent, although slightly different way. He noted that architecture is crystallized history. It represents the life of the past in visible and enduring form. And so the Centennial unleashed this wave. And part of that wave was focused on housing and the house. And to mix my metaphors, there were a number of strands to just that subset of interest in our past. After the Centennial, there was a growth, maybe an explosion in, I've counted 7 aspects of American history related to housing and building. And in no particular order, they include renewed interest in research, the creation of house museums, the creation of hereditary or lineage societies, an interest in owning a country house, and often with the hope of improving it, a renewed interest in preservation, a very American interest in commerce built on the new interest in our past, and ultimately the new designs, the buildings of the Colonial Revival. I don't know why this image never shows, but there we go. So a quick canter through some of those. Research into old houses blossomed after the Centennial. And this was done both for the layman and for architects. And it includes sort of overall atmospheric views as well as detailed drawings with specific elements that might be of interest to architects looking to be inspired or even to recreate them. And just to run through some of these, in the upper left is a watercolor sketch that was done by Whitefield as part of the research for his somewhat ponderously named Homes of Our Forefathers, being a selection of the oldest and most interesting buildings, historical houses, and noted places in Rhode Island and Connecticut. And that was published in 1882. In the upper right is a drawing of framing details with dimensions from Albert Frederick Brown and Norman Morrison Isham's Early Connecticut Houses, an historical and architectural study, published in 1900. In the lower right is a drawing from J. Frederick Kelly's Early Domestic Architecture of Connecticut from 1924. In the center is the frontispiece from one of the White Pine series of monographs. Those were published from 1915 to 1931 as standalone monographs and a marketing tool for the white pine lumber industry. They were then merged with pencil points and ran until 1940. And although that is labeled Dwellings of Newbury Old Town, the illustration is actually of the Norton House in Guilford. In the lower left is the Architects Emergency Committee. This was a group formed during the Depression to provide work for out-of-work architects. And you can see here that these elevations of paneling are really quite detailed and provide all of the molding profiles that one might need if you're interested in recreating them. Another outgrowth of the Centennial and the renewed interest in houses was the creation of house museums. Much of the population was now interested in seeing and understanding the buildings of our past, and to do that, they needed somewhere to go. As I mentioned earlier, preservation and house museums was deemed at that time an appropriate activity for women. These were women following in the footsteps of Anne Pamela Cunningham. On the right, you can see the Highland House in Guildford. On the left is a photograph of the members of the Dorothy Whitfield Historic Society. The website for the house says the following: "It might be an exaggeration to call them madcap, but the original madcap Dorothys, as the founding ladies of the Dorothy Whitfield Historic Society are affectionately known, were certainly high-spirited. In 1916, when the stilted social graces of the time permeated their afternoon teas, the Dorothys discovered a common cause and displayed a wonderful sense of fun and adventure to save an important piece of Guildford history." And interestingly, tea houses were one of the few commercial endeavors that it was felt, again, appropriate for a woman of the middle class to engage in. So often you will see tea houses and housed in historic houses. And, this serving and selling of tea became a means of fundraising to preserve buildings. In the upper left is a photograph of the restoration work being done at the Whitfield House in Guildford in the 1920s under the leadership of J. Frederick Kelly. Interestingly, there is also a women's group connection to the Whitfield House, as negotiations were underway to transfer ownership to the state. There were two women's groups that were interested in being chosen to run the building and run the museum. Ultimately, the Colonial Society, the Connecticut Society of Colonial Dames, won out. And just an interesting modern note that I will raise here and come back to later from the official website for the Whitfield House. The Henry Whitfield House, quote, "The Henry Whitfield House is a physical reminder of the European settler colonialism of the 1600s, as well as the Colonial Revival era of the 1800s, 1900s, that celebrated and glorified European ethnocentricity and superiority. The museum is striving to confront the facts about the site's history in order to acknowledge past injustice, recognize how that injustice manifests in society today, and work towards an equitable future for all people." So obviously, historic house museums are trying to respond to modern questions and concerns. Another aspect of the Colonial Revival was that it renewed interest, or created interest, in the ownership of country houses by urban dwellers, or in many cases, suburban dwellers. But the urge to own a piece of history, and in many cases improve it, demonstrated itself in a new second home market for historic buildings. So this trend was highlighted by contemporary articles like How We Went Shopping for a Country House, Country Life in 1907, that recounted the trials of a well-heeled couple in search of a historic house to make their own, or statements like that made by Robert Swain Peabody of the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns, who wrote about an idealized American past that these country houses might offer. Quote, "We too want to live amid wainscoting, nestle in elliptical arched nooks, warm ourselves beneath the high mantles at blazing wood fires." Great example of this is in the center. It is one of the many buildings in New Canaan that at the beginning of the 20th century were bought up by New Yorkers. In a summary of nearly 20 buildings in the local paper, there were mentions of things like building a fine summer residence on Oak Ridge, enlarging and improving houses, the creation of a gentleman's country residence from an older house, and work that converted the old place into a modern dwelling. All of that from 1905. In this case, the improvement was to introduce a room fully paneled with panels purported to have come from Nicholas Brady's mansion in Esfada on Long Island. Contents of that house were sold off in 1937 when the building was donated to the Society of Jesus of the Roman Catholic Church. In Esfada, it was filled with furniture and architectural relics collected during the Brady's travels in Europe. So this is a combination of the Colonial Revival with a slightly earlier aspect of the Grand Tour thrown in. Another aspect of this renewed sense of Americanism was the creation of hereditary or lineage societies. These were memberships based on your ancestry. And they are obviously, and the statement from the Whitfield House highlights this, they are a double-edged sword. In many cases, they provide a place for women, but they also, since they are based on ancestry, and, quote, American, unquote, ancestry, there's no place for recent or even not so recent immigrants. In a funny footnote to some of the earlier discussion, the colonial dames are some of the most strict about, and colonial dames are one of these ancestry societies, hereditary societies, about their use of the word colonial. The National Society of the Colonial Dames of America requires proof that your ancestors rendered, quote, distinguished civil, military, or governing service in the colonies before July 5, 1776. Similarly, the Colonial Dames of America requires ancestors to have served or held public office in the original colonies between Jamestown's founding of May 13, 1607, and the Battle of Lexington, April 19th, in 1775. Most of these spring up not long after the Centennial. So you have the Sons of the American Revolution in 1889, their sister organization, the Daughters of the American Revolution, in 1890, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants in 1897. So while they are exclusive, they do, and that exclusivity is part of a broader trend of nationalism drifting into xenophobia that occurs both with the sense of, or newfound sense of the significance and importance of America, and being American and American ism, as well as a response to increased numbers of immigrants, and that continues through through the First World War and even into the Second World War, obviously. But the flip side of that is that these groups are antiquarian societies, and they both performed and supported excellent research. So here's just a couple of pages from the Colonial Dame's notes on the Darling Tavern in Woodbridge. Much of this work was done by Henry Schraub Kelly, who is J. Frederick Kelly's brother. As I mentioned earlier, there is also a commercial aspect to the efflorescence of interest in American history and in American houses after the Centennial. In the lower right is a picture of the Pardee Morris House in New Haven, proudly announcing their somewhat optimistic 1671 construction date, presumably hoping to attract visitors to what was at that point a seasonal boarding house. And then the other three images are associated with Wallace Nutting. Nutting was an early 20th century writer, photographer, furniture designer, and interestingly, operator of some of the history-driven tourism sites in the country. In 1916, at 55, Nutting, a Massachusetts minister turned entrepreneur, embarked on a commercial venture virtually untried in the United States up to that time. He created a collection of early American homes dotting the eastern seaboard, kept open, at least for a brief while, exclusively through the support of visitor and admission fees. Nutting transformed five New England homes from the 17th and 18th century into destinations for history-hungry tourists, and presented these homes collectively, despite the hundreds of miles that separated them, as the Wallace Nutting colonial chain of picture houses. There you can see one of Nutting's own photographs of the Arnold House in, in Rhode Island, Eleazar Arnold House in Lincoln of 1693, and then a photograph of costumed ladies in a colonial interior on the lower left. Now, we finally get to the new designs, to the Colonial Revival. These are buildings that run from academic to fantastic. They skew fancy and are less concerned with accuracy than Americanism. And they trickle down from well-known architects to unnamed builders. So in the upper right is a building that is often credited with being one of the earliest Colonial Revival buildings. It's in Newport, designed by McKim, Mead, and White in 1886. And again, you can see just pastiche is unfair, but a design made up of elements collected from a variety of colonial and early 19th century sources. So it appears to have a central hall plan. It's got dormers that alternate between pitched and barrel roofs. It's got a decorative frontispiece with a round-headed window. It's got an elaborate door surround. It's got not one but two, well, three porticos. It's sort of all the bells and whistles that you could want presented in a new design. To the left of that is John Frederick Kelly's 1929 New Haven Colony Historical Society, now the New Haven Museum. And again, it's got an arcaded portico or piazza. It's got round-headed windows. It's got a door surround inspired by the river god door surrounds. It's got a turret. It's got, circular windows in the tympana of the gables. It's got coins. It's got pilasters. It's got everything anyone could ask for and maybe a little bit more. Below that is the Old Fairfield Town Hall. This actually, at its core, has a 1795 courthouse that was built to replace its predecessor that had been burned by the British. During the 19th century, it received a Second Empire makeover, with a large mansard roof. And then in the 1930s, local architect Cameron Clark worked to bring it back to its late 18th century appearance. And as seems common, and here it may have been driven by space needs of the town, the building was improved with the addition of the two wings joined by hyphens to the main block. In the lower right is another interesting story. Again, at its heart, it's a 1891 Richard Morris Hunt design. The building was in the early 1930s purchased and reduced in size, but it still maintains, many of the hallmarks of high-style colonial revival. It's got a portico, it's got a balustrade, it's got circular windows in the gables. It's got double-hunged multi-pane windows. It's again got a whole lot. At the other end of the spectrum are the sort of more popular interpretations of the colonial colonial revival, in the center, I think something would probably be sold now as a starter home. It is, quote, new ideas by small home architects, or the book includes those. And it's sold by a lumber company, which will, of course, provide the the materials to recreate with modern conveniences fairly faithfully a Cape Cod house. On the right is a Royal Barry Wills design for a slightly elevated Colonial Revival house with brick ends, a frontispiece, a tripartite window, dormers, a balustrade running across the roof. Lower left is a Colonial Revival house on Deer Hill Avenue in Danbury. And again, it's a little bit elevated. dormers with round-headed windows, um, a portico, perhaps inspired by the White House, an elaborate door surround, probably taken from the early 19th century, um, you know, flat arches with their keystones made of a separate material, all the bells and whistles. And then in the upper left, a garrison colonial design from 1949, recreating the overhang of a framed overhang house, but placing the brick chimney outside the gable end because that's a little bit cheaper and easier for the builder to make. And it frees up the center of the building for use. So back to my original question. How colonial was the Colonial Revival? Well, Price, who I quoted in the beginning, had a smart and facile response to that. He noted most important of all the aspects of early American architecture, his term for colonial architecture, is the consideration of its general spirit, which seems to make itself felt irrespective of locality or of the specific type or style peculiar to a given locality. Yet this spirit is by no means easy to define, for it is made up of several fundamental traits which are nearly always apparent in our earlier buildings. Above all, early American builders built as well as they knew how, both in terms of design and of materials. So he seems to be saying there is an ineffable Americanness about the colonial and the colonial revival, and historical accuracy may not be so significant. And I share that opinion. Um, as a recovering latchkey kid from the last century, I have a love of frozen pizza. I'm not proud of it. I know it's not a white clam of beets from Pepe's, but I still like it. I just don't think of a Stouffer's after-school frozen treat as pizza. And that's more or less where I am with the Colonial Revival style. Did it bring back colonial designs? Partially. It certainly brought back elements of them. But I would say ultimately not really. And that's okay. The Colonial Revival designs can be delicious on their own. Just don't think of them as direct descendants of the 17th and 18th century. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Sure. Let me see if I can go back to the screen sharing and take myself off. All right. Good. So you've reclaimed control, Jane?
I think so.
Good.
Can you stop sharing? You're still sharing.
I'm still sharing. All right.
There. Now I can see everybody.
Okay.
Super. Well, I'd like to open it up to the floor if anybody had a question or a comment. You did cover a lot of ground, James.
I know. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's good. Well, I know many of us have been looking forward to this talk, and of course, you did not disappoint. I really enjoyed all of the research you've put into it and sharing all of your comments with us. I guess if no one wants to be bold and ask a question, we can wrap up. We're a little bit over time, but that's okay. Well, again, thank you so much, James. It's been great to reconnect with you. And glad we have this program to add to our library. So everyone can share that if you'd like to, put it back out there to your friends. And don't forget to join us at another Talking About Preservation. We'll be in person in Ridgefield in July. And of course, become a member of Preservation Connecticut if you're not a member already. So thank you all very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, James.